In the sleek, polished interior of a high-powered corporate boardroom, a sea of executives sat around an imposing glass table, their expensive suits and ties a clear display of their status. The room buzzed with conversation and the rustling of papers, each person eager to impress the Saudi tycoon at the head of the table. He was a man of immense wealth and influence, his reputation preceding him like a cloud of authority. As the meeting reached a critical point, the tycoon, with an air of superiority, leaned forward in his chair and switched to Arabic, a language that he assumed no one in the room would understand. His words, smooth and deliberate, were clearly not meant for the ears of the executives seated around him but for his own amusement, as though to remind them of his vast power and privilege. He spoke of his plans, his ambitions, and his calculated moves in the world of business, each sentence dripping with the unspoken belief that his intelligence and culture were far above anyone else in the room. The executives listened attentively, their heads nodding in deference, but none of them could respond in kind. They had no way of understanding the full depth of the tycoon's words. They sat there, uncomfortable but unwilling to show it, their faces masking the tension building in the room. The silent language barrier hung heavy in the air, a subtle but undeniable divide. As the tycoon finished his statement, there was a brief pause. The room held its breath, waiting for someone to speak, but no one dared to break the silence. The executives were all too eager to stay within their carefully constructed personas, reluctant to acknowledge their own inability to engage in the conversation that had just unfolded before them. It was in this moment of anticipation, when everyone expected the silence to stretch on, that something unexpected happened. From the back of the room, unnoticed by many, the janitor, a black man dressed in the humble blue uniform of his profession, stepped forward. He had been quietly going about his work, sweeping the floors and tidying the room, invisible to most of the high-ranking individuals in the meeting. Yet, in that moment, as if summoned by some unseen force, he walked towards the center of the room with a quiet confidence that seemed to ripple through the atmosphere. His presence, initially overlooked, now commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Without a hint of hesitation, the janitor looked directly at the Saudi tycoon and, in perfect Arabic, responded to the question that had just been posed. His voice was steady, fluent, and precise, every word carrying the weight of someone who had not only learned the language but had mastered it with a depth of understanding that many in the room, particularly the tycoon, would never have expected. The shock was immediate. The executives froze, their mouths agape, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The tycoon himself, for the first time since entering the room, appeared stunned, his expression faltering as he tried to process the words that had come from someone he had dismissed so easily. The room, once filled with the hum of corporate chatter, was now deafeningly silent. No one spoke. No one moved. The weight of the moment hung in the air, thick with the implications of what had just occurred. The janitor, once invisible, once assumed to be nothing more than a quiet servant, had just shattered every assumption, every stereotype, that had been placed upon him. In that brief exchange, he had done more than correct the tycoon's words, he had commanded the respect of everyone in the room. The irony was impossible to ignore. A man whose existence had been relegated to the background had just outshone the very people who had believed themselves to be superior. The executives, so eager to rise in the corporate world, had been humbled by the quiet dignity and mastery of someone they had never once considered capable of such intelligence or skill. The tycoon, his pride stung and his face now flushed, could say nothing. His earlier smugness had evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that only deepened the respect the janitor had earned in that moment. The janitor's gaze remained calm, not triumphant, but simply certain. He had no need to prove anything further. His words, his actions, had already spoken louder than any of the polished, rehearsed speeches of the executives in the room. In a world obsessed with power, status, and appearance, this single moment served as a powerful reminder that true strength, intelligence, and capability are not bound by class, by appearance, or by preconceived notions. The janitor, in his humble uniform, had revealed that expertise and wisdom can be found in the most unexpected places. His quiet mastery, his willingness to step forward in the face of arrogance, had broken down the barriers of assumption, challenging the room to reconsider everything they thought they knew about status and intellect. As the meeting continued, there was a palpable shift in the room. The executives now looked at the janitor with a new sense of respect, some with embarrassment, others with a quiet admiration. The Tycoon, now visibly humbled, no longer held the same air of superiority. The walls of ignorance had been torn down, and in their place stood the undeniable truth, that strength lies in the quiet, unseen mastery of the unassuming. It was a moment that would linger in the minds of everyone present, a reminder that, sometimes, the loudest lesson comes from the most unexpected teacher. The boardroom was filled with the hum of tense conversation as executives in sharp suits sat around a glossy conference table, their eyes focused on the Saudi tycoon standing at the head. The man's tailored suit spoke of wealth, power, and influence, and he carried himself with the kind of authority that only years of success and business acumen could afford. As he began to speak, his voice was smooth, his words calculated to command attention. But instead of addressing the room in English, as had been expected, he chose Arabic, an intentional move that carried more than just linguistic meaning. The executives, most of whom knew only a smattering of the language, exchanged uncomfortable glances. There was a subtle edge to the way the tycoon spoke, as though he were sending a message that only those who understood the intricacies of the language truly belonged at the table. His words, though polite, were steeped in exclusivity, designed to remind everyone in the room of his elevated status, of how his wealth and connections set him apart from those who weren't as well versed in the world of power, influence, and language. Some of the executives, eager to appear competent, nodded along, pretending to understand, while others simply looked down at their papers, trying to mask their discomfort. But amidst the high-powered businessmen, another presence lingered unnoticed, a quiet, humble figure who had been there all along. The janitor, a black man in a simple blue uniform, had been going about his work as usual, mopping the floors, wiping down the windows, and attending to the less glamorous tasks of the corporate world. He had been invisible to everyone in the room, just a face among many who came and went without much thought. His job was to clean, not to participate in the affairs of the boardroom. But in that moment, something shifted. As the Saudi tycoon's words filled the air, the janitor's movements slowed. His hands, steady as always, paused mid-swipe on the floor. He stood up straight, his back tall and his gaze steady. The room, still caught in the tension of the tycoon's speech, didn't notice at first, but soon they would. As the tycoon spoke again, he turned to one of the executives, his tone still laced with condescension. "I trust you understand," he asked, his words sharp, a subtle challenge in the air. He was expecting an awkward silence, the uncertainty of those who didn't understand. But what happened next took everyone by surprise. From the far side of the room, a voice broke through the murmur of the boardroom, calm, measured, and fluent in the very language the tycoon had been using. "Yes," the janitor said, stepping forward, "I understand perfectly." The words hung in the air, catching everyone off guard. The tycoon turned slowly, his face initially blank, before registering the speaker's identity. The janitor, whose very presence had been taken for granted, now stood at the center of the room, his voice strong and his words deliberate. There was no arrogance in his tone, no desire to show off, only quiet confidence. The silence in the room was deafening. The Tycoon, momentarily stunned, raised an eyebrow, trying to mask his surprise. The executives around the table shifted uncomfortably, their gazes flicking between the janitor and the Tycoon. In an instant, the power dynamic in the room had shifted. No longer was the janitor a mere figure who pushed a broom or mopped the floors. He was a man of knowledge, a man who could not be easily dismissed, even in the midst of a room full of corporate elites. The janitor, whose job had been to clean the room, now had the floor. His simple act of responding, in perfect fluency, had shattered the image that the Tycoon had worked so hard to cultivate. His knowledge, once invisible, now took on a power of its own. The Tycoon, though still trying to maintain his composure, found himself suddenly vulnerable. The room had turned. No longer could anyone dismiss the janitor as someone less than or unworthy of recognition. He had earned their attention, not by power, but by the quiet strength of his knowledge. "You speak Arabic?" the Tycoon asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. The janitor nodded. "Fluently," he replied simply. His eyes were calm, unbothered by the weight of the room's scrutiny. He wasn't there to prove anything, he wasn't there to show off or assert dominance. He was simply stating the truth. The executives, who had once looked past him, now watched with open astonishment. They had expected the janitor to stay in his place, hidden in the background, unseen and unheard. They had assumed that his job, his uniform, and his appearance had defined his worth. But now, with one quiet act of defiance, the janitor had made them question their biases, their assumptions about him and about the world. The Tycoon's gaze lingered on the janitor for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing in thought. For the first time, he realized that power, knowledge, and respect were not defined by wealth, status, or appearances. It was a lesson that couldn't be bought, no matter how many zeros were in his bank account. The executives, too, began to stir, the discomfort in the air palpable as they realized their own oversight, their own blind spots. They had failed to see the janitor for who he truly was, a man who carried with him a wealth of knowledge and dignity, regardless of his role in the corporate hierarchy. The janitor, sensing the shift in the room, turned to leave, his presence no longer invisible. As he walked out, the door closing behind him, the room remained silent, the power of that brief exchange still hanging in the air. No one would forget what had happened there. The boardroom, once a place of exclusion and assumed superiority, had been transformed by the quiet power of knowledge and the reminder that respect is not something that can be demanded, it is earned, and often from the most unexpected places. The sleek, glass-walled conference room hummed with energy. The city skyline stretched out behind the long, polished table where several high-powered executives sat, their faces alight with anticipation. At the head of the table stood Fahad al-Mansur, a Saudi tycoon known for his wealth, influence, and business acumen. Today, he had come to give a lecture on international business, specifically to the company's high-level management team. His reputation preceded him, and his every word carried weight. Fahad, tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, stepped forward confidently. His voice was deep and commanding as he began speaking in Arabic, a language he believed would further impress his audience and cement his status. The executives leaned forward, nodding along, seemingly awestruck. Arabic, to them, was an exotic language, one that conveyed sophistication and power. Fahad paused for effect, making eye contact with his audience to gauge their reactions. "I trust you understand the importance of culture when doing business internationally," Fahad said, his words flowing smoothly, as if he were the king of this room. It is crucial to speak the language of your partners, to immerse yourself in their world. Only then can we truly build lasting relationships. He paused again, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. The executives exchanged impressed glances, clearly awed by his command of the language and his authority in the room. They were hanging on his every word, absorbing the lessons he imparted on leadership and negotiation. But as Fahad finished his speech and stood with a slight smirk, satisfied with the attention he had commanded, something unexpected happened. From the back of the room, near the door, a quiet voice spoke up. The janitor, James, who had been silently sweeping the floor at the far side of the conference room, turned toward Fahad. His movements were deliberate and calm, as though he had been waiting for just the right moment. So, we all understand the importance of the culture of business partners. But do you truly know how these relationships are built? The room fell silent. The executives stared at James in disbelief, unsure whether they had heard correctly. Fahad, too, paused, his expression faltering for just a fraction of a second. The words had come out effortlessly, in perfect Arabic, with a tone that was both measured and confident. There was no hesitation, no sign of uncertainty. For a moment, the room felt suspended in time. The janitor, whom none of them had paid any attention to, save for the occasional glance, had just spoken fluent Arabic with the same ease and clarity that Fahad had. Fahad, taken aback, narrowed his eyes, unsure how to respond. His smile, which had been so assured just moments ago, wavered. "Excuse me." Fahad's voice was slightly defensive, the air of superiority still lingering in his tone. James, unfazed, repeated his question more slowly, choosing his words carefully, though his confidence never wavered. "I asked if you truly understand how relationships are built, not just in terms of language, but through trust, respect, and mutual understanding." His voice was calm, but there was an underlying strength in it, a subtle but undeniable authority. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging over everyone. Fahad stood still for a beat, as though trying to recover from the sudden shift in the room's dynamic. He had come into this space expecting to be the undisputed voice of authority. But now, in the presence of this janitor, the balance had shifted. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected the janitor to simply stay in his place unseen and unheard, doing his job as quietly as he always did. But now, James wasn't just a janitor, he was someone who had shown them an entirely different side of the story, someone whose quiet presence had suddenly become a force to be reckoned with. Fahad, not one to lose face in public, straightened up and cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "I see. You speak Arabic very well," he said, his tone more subdued now, though still carrying a hint of pride. "But as I said, the language itself is just one part of understanding culture. It is the ability to navigate complex business dynamics that matters." James nodded slightly, but this time, he didn't need to say anything more. His mere presence, his calm and measured response, had already spoken volumes. Fahad's words had come from a place of assumption that his fluency in Arabic, and his position as a powerful businessman, gave him the upper hand. But James's response had stripped that assumption away. It wasn't about who spoke the loudest or who held the title of CEO or Tycoon. It was about knowledge, about wisdom, and about the power of listening and responding not just to language, but to people. The tension in the room lingered for a moment before one of the executives, a senior VP who had been silently observing, leaned forward. "I think James has a point," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was careful, respectful, but her words were deliberate. Business is about understanding more than just words. It's about understanding people, what drives them, how they see the world. Language is just the first step. Fahad glanced at her, then back at James. His earlier confidence had begun to crack, and he realized, perhaps for the first time, that authority could come from anywhere, not just from the people at the top of the corporate ladder, but from anyone with true knowledge and the courage to speak up. There was a subtle shift in the room's energy. The executives, who had once seen James as nothing more than a background figure, began to regard him differently. They had just witnessed a moment of transformation, where a janitor had not only shown his linguistic prowess but had also asserted his presence in the room, challenging the established dynamics of power and authority. Fahad's gaze softened, and after a brief pause, he nodded, this time with a hint of respect. "You're right," he said quietly. "Understanding people is the key to business success. Thank you for reminding me of that." James, standing with quiet dignity, gave a small nod in return. There was no need for further words, he had already made his point. The room had seen something that would forever change the way they viewed him. From that day forward, James wasn't just the janitor. He was a symbol of quiet authority, a reminder that true leadership doesn't always come in the form of titles or wealth, but in wisdom, presence, and the ability to challenge preconceived notions. And in that single moment, he had transformed from a background figure to an unexpected voice of authority, his words resonating far beyond the walls of that conference room. The boardroom was filled with a quiet hum as the Saudi tycoon stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Clad in a sharp suit, he exuded authority as he addressed the gathered executives, his voice rich with confidence. Speaking in fluent Arabic, he outlined his vision for a new venture, the words flowing smoothly and effortlessly, each phrase designed to assert his dominance and display his high-status position. The executives nodded, some furiously taking notes, others impressed by his commanding presence and linguistic prowess. For a moment, it seemed that all attention was entirely his, as if his wealth, position, and ability to speak Arabic set him apart from everyone else in the room. However, as he spoke, something unusual happened. The janitor, who had been quietly mopping the floor at the back of the room, paused mid-stroke. He was a black man, dressed in the humble uniform of his role, his face stoic and focused on his work. He had been almost invisible in the background. His job was to clean, to remain unseen and unheard, and that was exactly how the room regarded him. But as the Saudi tycoon continued, something in the conversation caught the janitor's ear. Without a second thought, he put down his mop, stood up, and with a calm yet confident stride, walked toward the center of the room. The room's attention, once fixated on the tycoon, shifted to the janitor. The executives looked up in surprise, some slightly annoyed at the interruption, but the janitor's unwavering focus gave no hint of apology or uncertainty. With a clear and deliberate voice, he addressed the tycoon in perfect, fluid Arabic, responding to the man's statement as if they were equals, engaging in the same conversation. The room fell into stunned silence. The tycoon, momentarily caught off guard, blinked in disbelief. His eyes widened as he processed the fact that the janitor, this man he had viewed as invisible, as nothing more than a background figure, spoke Arabic fluently, effortlessly matching him in both skill and sophistication. The words he had assumed to be exclusive to him alone were now shared by someone who, by all appearances, didn't fit into the world of high-powered boardrooms or luxury deals. The executives, who had barely given the janitor a passing thought up until that moment, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their assumptions about his background, his abilities, his place in the world had been shattered in an instant. This was not the uneducated, humble worker they had imagined. This was a man who possessed an invaluable skill that had gone unnoticed, a man whose true potential had been hidden beneath layers of judgment and prejudice. The Tycoon, recovering from the surprise, smiled awkwardly, a slight tension in his shoulders. He had intended to impress the room with his linguistic prowess, but now he found himself sharing the floor with someone who was just as capable, if not more so, in this very realm. It was a humbling moment, one that forced him to reconsider what it truly meant to possess power, to command respect. The janitor, noticing the silence that had fallen over the room, simply nodded and turned to leave. His presence, his words, had already done their job. He had not sought the spotlight, nor had he intended to challenge the Tycoon's authority. But in a single, quiet moment, he had exposed the fallacy that one's worth could be determined by appearance or title. Power, he had just shown, was not confined to those with the most impressive resumes or the most expensive suits. True power lay in talent, in knowledge, and in the ability to surprise the world by simply being who you truly were. The room remained silent for a few moments longer, the weight of the janitor's words still hanging in the air. Slowly, one of the executives, an older man who had seen his fair share of corporate dealings, broke the silence. "Well," he said, his voice measured but with an undercurrent of admiration, "that was a turn of events." The other executives, still trying to process what had just happened, nodded in agreement. They had been reminded, in the most unexpected way, that the value of a person could never be judged by their outward appearance or the role they played in a company. What mattered was the depth of their experience, the extent of their knowledge, and the quiet power that often went unrecognized. As the janitor quietly left the room, the executives exchanged glances, their views on authority, success, and talent forever altered. The Saudi Tycoon, no longer the undisputed center of attention, sat back in his chair, his pride deflated but his respect for the janitor growing. He had been humbled not by the janitor's position or his status, but by the quiet strength that had been there all along, hidden beneath the surface. The lesson was clear: true talent, real power, was not always visible, and it could not be confined by titles or roles. It was a humbling reminder that every person, no matter how small their role may seem, could possess something extraordinary that could reshape the very dynamics of a room. In that moment, the janitor had not just surprised the Tycoon, he had redefined what it meant to hold power in the corporate world. In the opulent boardroom of one of the world's most influential companies, a hush fell over the room as the executives gathered for their quarterly meeting. The long table was polished to perfection, its surface reflecting the bright fluorescent lights overhead. Every seat was occupied by men and women dressed in immaculate suits, their expressions a mixture of ambition and expectation. At the head of the table sat Sultan Al Fahd, a Saudi tycoon known for his vast wealth, his global business empire, and his knack for asserting his dominance in any room he entered. His presence alone commanded attention, and he carried himself with the poise of someone who had the world at his fingertips. As the meeting began, Sultan glanced around the room at his colleagues, all of them eager to hear his thoughts on the company's latest initiatives. He was a master of projecting power, often using his commanding presence to steer conversations in his favor. But today, he had a particular strategy in mind. He had recently learned a few phrases in Arabic, his native tongue, and decided to use them to assert his cultural authority, believing it would impress the others. He cleared his throat, a slight smirk crossing his face. "In my country," he began, switching seamlessly from English to Arabic, "we pride ourselves on the importance of tradition and knowledge. These principles are the foundation of our success. The room fell silent, the executives exchanging looks of awe. They had heard Sultan speak in various languages before, but Arabic, his mother tongue, was something they knew he reserved for moments of supreme importance. They listened intently, nodding in approval as he spoke, their admiration growing with each word he uttered. The subtle power play was working. However, as Sultan continued speaking, his eyes briefly flicked toward the back of the room, where a janitor, a black man named Malik, was quietly sweeping the floor. Malik was always present at these meetings, his role humble, his presence often overlooked. He wasn't a part of the high-powered discussions, he wasn't an executive, and he wasn't wealthy. He was just another face in the background, a man who cleaned up after the business elite, never drawing attention to himself. But today, something was different. As Sultan's speech reached its peak, Malik paused mid-sweep. Without hesitation, he walked over to the table, his movements calm and deliberate. The executives glanced up, their curiosity piqued. Sultan continued to speak, his smug smile widening, unaware that Malik was about to change the course of the meeting in a way no one could have predicted. Malik approached the head of the table, his presence now commanding attention. His shoes clicked softly against the marble floor as he stood before Sultan, his posture upright, but not defiant. He simply waited for a moment, letting the weight of the room's expectation build. Then, with a quiet, measured voice, he responded to Sultan in flawless Arabic. "Indeed, tradition and knowledge are vital to success," Malik said, his words ringing through the room with clarity and authority. "But it is also important to remember that true power comes not from language or wealth, but from the integrity with which we use our knowledge." The effect was instantaneous. The room, which had been so focused on Sultan and his carefully crafted speech, fell into complete silence. The executives blinked, exchanging confused glances. Sultan, who had been so sure of his superiority, froze. His smirk faltered, and his lips parted as he tried to process what had just happened. Malik's words were simple, no grand gesture, no arrogance, but they carried with them a depth of knowledge that left Sultan speechless. The janitor, a man whom no one had ever expected to speak in such an articulate and powerful manner, had just exposed the fragility of Sultan's carefully constructed facade. For a moment, no one spoke. Sultan, usually so quick to dominate any conversation, found himself at a loss. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the image he had of himself as a cultural authority with the reality that the man cleaning the floors had just proven himself his equal, if not his superior, in terms of knowledge and eloquence. It was a humbling realization. Malik didn't wait for a response. He simply nodded, acknowledging the weight of the room's gaze, and walked back to his position at the back of the room. His actions were deliberate, but there was no air of triumph. His confidence had never been loud. It was quiet, composed, and unassuming. The room remained in stunned silence for several long seconds, and then, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere shifted. Sultan, who had been so certain that his wealth and status would always place him at the top, now felt a deep sense of discomfort. His eyes lingered on Malik's retreating figure, a quiet recognition beginning to dawn on him. In that moment, the lesson was clear: true respect was not earned through outward displays of power or status, but through the depth of one's knowledge, character, and integrity. One by one, the executives who had once looked at Sultan with admiration began to look inward, reflecting on their own biases. They had all been complicit in elevating individuals based on wealth, appearance, and position, without ever questioning the true substance of those they admired. The meeting continued, but something had changed. The dynamic had shifted, and for the rest of the day, the executives carried with them the quiet reminder that respect cannot be bought or demanded, it must be earned through actions, through knowledge, and through the quiet strength of one's character. Sultan, for the first time in a long while, sat in silence, no longer the center of attention. He knew, deep down, that Malik's simple yet powerful intervention had taught him a valuable lesson. True respect, it seemed, was far more complex than the wealth and status he had relied upon for so many years. And from that moment on, the room would never be the same. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Strength and respect lie not in outward appearances, but in the quiet, unassuming power of knowledge and integrity. The boardroom buzzed with tension as the Saudi tycoon, Khalid al-Mansur, took his seat at the head of the table, his presence commanding attention. Dressed in a crisp white thobe and exuding an air of confidence, Khalid was a titan of industry, a man whose name alone carried weight in business circles. The room full of executives, all dressed in immaculate suits, were ready to listen attentively to whatever insights he would share. The stakes were high, and the atmosphere was thick with expectation. Khalid smiled to himself, savoring the power he wielded. He knew the executives at the table would look up to him, would hang on to his every word. After all, he had built an empire from the ground up. His wealth, influence, and status were unparalleled. He was used to having the upper hand, to being the one others deferred to. As the discussion about international expansion began, Khalid leaned back in his chair, his hands folding together as he spoke, choosing his words carefully in his native Arabic. At first, the room remained quiet, the executives nodding in agreement as they absorbed the tycoon's words, but then, unexpectedly, a voice cut through the conversation. "Excuse me, sir," a calm, steady voice said from behind them. The executives turned, startled to see a figure standing at the door: Jamal, the janitor. He was dressed simply, in the worn-out uniform of someone who spent his days cleaning floors and emptying trash. No one had expected him to speak, let alone interrupt the conversation of a powerful man like Khalid. The room fell into an awkward silence as everyone, including Khalid, turned to see what would happen next. Jamal, who had been quietly working in the background throughout the meeting, was not someone anyone had thought twice about. To most, he was invisible, just another figure in the background whose job was to keep the place clean. But what the room did not know was that Jamal, despite his role as a janitor, was not someone to be underestimated. He had spent years immersing himself in different cultures, learning new languages, and expanding his knowledge not just to survive, but to thrive in a world that often overlooked him. With a steady gaze, Jamal responded in perfect Arabic, "If you don't mind, Mr. Al-Mansur, I believe your expansion strategy should take into account the local market dynamics. It's not just about wealth, it's about cultural sensitivity and understanding the unique needs of each region." The room froze. The executives stared in disbelief, their mouths agape. Khalid, who had assumed his use of Arabic would be a silent power play, a way to speak freely without anyone understanding, was now left speechless. For a brief moment, the smug grin that had adorned his face disappeared, replaced by a flicker of surprise. He hadn't expected this, especially from someone like Jamal. The janitor's words, spoken fluently and with confidence, had punctured the bubble of superiority Khalid had carefully constructed. His confidence wavered, and for the first time, he realized that his position as a wealthy tycoon didn't guarantee that he knew everything. Jamal's voice had not been loud or forceful, but there was a quiet authority in it that reverberated across the room. The power dynamic in the boardroom shifted subtly but undeniably. Khalid, who had once been the unquestioned leader, now found himself facing someone who, despite his seemingly lower status, held an undeniable command of language, culture, and insight. Jamal wasn't merely a janitor in that moment, he was a challenger, someone whose knowledge and intellect demanded respect. For the first time, the executives, who had been busy deferring to Khalid's words, turned their attention to Jamal. Some exchanged glances, others raised their eyebrows. They had been conditioned to listen only to the men in suits, the ones with the titles and the power. But now, they were confronted with a profound truth: knowledge and skill weren't defined by one's role or position. They were defined by what a person brought to the table, regardless of where they came from. Khalid cleared his throat, his pride pricking at the edges of his consciousness. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially by someone like Jamal. His lips parted, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He had no defense. How could he explain to the room that a janitor had just outclassed him in his own language? That his own assumption about the janitor's intelligence had been entirely wrong? Jamal didn't wait for a reply. He simply stood there, calm and collected, as if he hadn't just shattered the very hierarchy that had governed the room. With the same quiet dignity, he added, "You'll find that true success in any market comes from listening, not just speaking. If you seek to connect with people, you must first understand them. That goes beyond just language, it's about culture, values, and the ways in which we interact with the world." His words echoed through the boardroom, and for the first time, it was clear, Jamal's wisdom far surpassed the role he had been assigned. The executives, who had once viewed him as invisible, now saw him in a new light. It wasn't his uniform that defined him, but his insights, his mastery of language, and his ability to offer a perspective that transcended his apparent status. Khalid, who had once worn his arrogance like armor, now found himself humbled. His posture shifted, his hands no longer folded confidently, but resting in his lap, as he considered Jamal's words. For a moment, he thought about how many times in his life he had dismissed others because of their outward appearance or their position in society. He had been so wrapped up in his wealth and status that he had failed to see the true value of what people could bring to the table. The room was still, the weight of Jamal's intervention hanging in the air. It wasn't just a correction, it was a powerful lesson in humility, in the recognition that true authority isn't about titles or wealth, it's about understanding, insight, and respect for others. And in that moment, Jamal, the janitor, became the most powerful person in the room, not through force, but through knowledge and a quiet strength that no amount of money or status could ever overshadow. The boardroom was opulent, gleaming with polished marble floors and walls adorned with contemporary art. A group of high-powered professionals, all sharply dressed, sat around an expansive oval table, awaiting the keynote speaker of the day. It was a prestigious event, filled with businessmen, investors, and corporate elites, gathered to discuss the future of the global market. Their minds were sharp, their ambitions high, and their egos perhaps the sharpest of all on full display. The man at the center of the room, speaking confidently in Arabic, was none other than Omar Al-Fahd, a Saudi tycoon whose name carried weight in business circles across the world. His reputation preceded him, he was known for his vast empire, his investments in tech, and his control over entire sectors of industry. To many in the room, he was the epitome of success, the embodiment of authority. As he spoke, his words laced with assertiveness and power, the attendees nodded in agreement, hanging on every word. Omar's voice resonated with the unmistakable confidence of someone who had built his empire through wealth and influence, as if the language itself was a tool for him to wield his superiority. His carefully chosen phrases echoed through the room like an orchestra, reinforcing the idea that he was the one in control, the one who dictated the course of the conversation. There was a certain smugness to his delivery, a sense of certainty that no one could challenge him, not in this room, not with his background, not with his status. He spoke as if his very presence was enough to command respect, as if the mere act of speaking in his native tongue was a reminder of his heritage and the power that came with it. But as his speech carried on, something unusual began to unfold, something that none of the highly trained professionals had expected. From the far corner of the room, a figure quietly moved in the background, cleaning up after the meeting. It was James, a black janitor who had been working at the building for years. He wasn't part of the meeting, not in the official sense. His job was to quietly clean, to sweep the floors, and to keep the space pristine while the professionals did their work. His uniform was simple dark pants and a faded shirt with the company logo on it, but his presence in the room had always gone unnoticed, dismissed as someone who was there simply to maintain the space, never to partake in its conversations. But as Omar continued speaking in Arabic, James paused for a moment. His mop hung loosely in his hand, but his eyes narrowed slightly as the words flowed from the Tycoon's mouth. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone had become mesmerized by the richness of Omar's words, assuming they were witnessing not just a powerful businessman, but a man who spoke with authority, whose knowledge was vast and untouchable. However, without warning, James, the janitor, cleared his throat and took a small step forward. The room fell into a stunned silence. James spoke, his voice calm but firm, his words rolling off his tongue with perfect fluency in Arabic. There was no hesitation in his tone, no uncertainty. His command of the language was flawless, every syllable sharp and clear, every word deliberate and measured. The words he spoke, while not loud, carried a weight that contrasted with his humble appearance. His gaze remained steady as he addressed Omar, without the slightest trace of deference. Omar paused mid-sentence, his confident smirk faltering as his eyes met James's. The room, still stunned, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what had just happened. The professionals around the table had been so focused on Omar's authority, his title, and his pedigree that they had failed to notice the quiet strength in the background. James had always been there, cleaning up after their meetings, maintaining their pristine environment, but in that moment, he had silently positioned himself as an equal if not more. The air in the room felt thicker now, charged with an unfamiliar energy. James didn't boast, didn't challenge Omar directly, but the clarity of his response, the quiet assertion of his intelligence and fluency in the language was enough to completely reverse the power dynamics. His calmness and unwavering demeanor flipped the script. What had been an atmosphere of respect for Omar, the Tycoon, now became one of contemplation. The very idea that someone in the background, someone whose title was janitor, could speak with such authority, with such knowledge, had taken everyone by surprise. In a room where titles mattered, where status was a defining factor, James's words now carried the weight of respect, not because of his position, but because of the strength of his character, his knowledge, and his quiet confidence. Omar, for the first time that day, was silent. His words faltered as he realized the shift. The people around him, the same ones who had nodded in agreement with his every word, now looked toward James with a mixture of surprise and newfound respect. The tension was palpable as they processed the fact that knowledge wasn't confined to a title, that respect wasn't based on status or wealth, but rather on substance and substance alone. The lesson was clear, though it was never directly spoken: authority could not be dictated by appearances, wealth, or the languages spoken. It was not about who commanded the room with force or bravado, it was about who spoke with truth, who possessed the quiet strength to stand on equal footing with anyone, no matter their title. In that moment, James had quietly but firmly shown the room that wisdom and authority could come from the most unexpected places, and that the assumptions based on someone's position or outward appearance were, in fact, the true flaw. The room, once filled with the sound of corporate jargon and ostentatious displays of power, now stood in silence, reflecting on the weight of the shift they had just witnessed. James, without a word more, turned back to his cleaning, his quiet act of defiance leaving a lasting impact on everyone in the room. The professionals once so sure of their place now sat with a newfound understanding. Respect had been earned, but not in the way they had expected. It wasn't about wealth or status, it was about the strength of one's character, the depth of one's knowledge, and the grace with which one carries themselves. In that moment, James had redefined authority not by taking a position, but by quietly asserting his worth. The corporate boardroom was sleek and polished, a high-rise fortress of glass and steel that seemed to echo with the power of its occupants. The long, dark wood table gleamed under the soft fluorescent lights, reflecting the faces of the elite men and women who occupied the room. The air was thick with the weight of important decisions and high-stakes negotiations. At the head of the table sat Khalid Al-Fahad, a Saudi tycoon whose wealth and influence stretched far beyond the borders of his homeland. He was well known for his shrewd business acumen and the aura of superiority that often accompanied his presence. Today, as the meeting wore on, he felt particularly poised to assert his power, to remind everyone of who he was and where he came from. With a swift glance at his colleagues, Khalid shifted in his chair, preparing to make a point that he believed would elevate his stature in the room. He leaned forward and spoke in Arabic, the rich, melodic cadence of the language ringing out with the confidence of a man who knew his words would command attention. He made no effort to translate, assuming that his colleagues, mostly American and European executives, wouldn't understand. The intent was clear: he wanted to impress them, to assert his cultural superiority in the one way he knew would be most effective. He said with a smile that was almost predatory, the words flowing effortlessly. "They won't understand what we're saying." His colleagues glanced at one another uncomfortably, some unsure whether they should be offended, others just confused, but Khalid continued, his voice thick with the unspoken challenge, "You are beneath me." It was an arrogant move, one he believed would fracture the cohesion of the group, create a barrier of exclusivity and privilege. But what happened next was not what Khalid expected. From the back of the room, the janitor, a man who had remained largely unnoticed by the board, shifted his stance. He was a black man, his uniform a far cry from the tailored suits of the executives. He had been silently sweeping the floor for most of the meeting, performing his duties without a word, without drawing attention. His role in the room had been clear to everyone: he was a mere servant, there to clean, to maintain the space. But he was not invisible. With calm precision, the janitor stepped forward, his presence now undeniable. Without hesitation, he spoke in fluent Arabic, answering Khalid's statement with a quiet authority that stopped the room in its tracks. The janitor said, his tone unruffled, his words measured. "If you think this will impress them or divide them, you are mistaken." The room went completely silent. Khalid's confident expression faltered, his eyes widening in disbelief. He had not expected this. The janitor, a man who had been relegated to the background, had just addressed him in the very language he had used to assert his superiority. And what was more, the janitor's fluency was flawless, the cadence of his words steady, his mastery of the language impeccable. The executives, previously distracted by the ongoing discussion, turned their attention to the exchange. The power dynamics in the room shifted in an instant. For the first time, Khalid felt small. His wealth, his status, his cultural identity, all the things he had relied on to maintain control were no longer enough. The janitor, with nothing more than his command of a language, had taken back the power in a way that transcended status, race, and wealth. His words were not just an answer, they were a quiet revolution, a challenge to the assumptions and biases that had governed the meeting until now. The executives, who had been largely passive observers of Khalid's display of power, now looked at the janitor with newfound respect. Some, unsure how to react, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others exchanged looks, their minds racing. What had just happened? The janitor was a symbol of something far more profound than any of them had realized: the power of intellect, of skill, of quiet resistance. Khalid, unable to speak for a moment, finally recovered his composure, but his earlier confidence was gone. He cleared his throat, his voice now less sure as he attempted to regain control of the conversation. I didn't know you spoke Arabic," he stammered, trying to mask his unease behind a forced smile. The janitor, unperturbed, simply nodded. "I know many languages," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Language is not a tool for separation, but for connection. It is not a symbol of power, but of understanding." And in that moment, everything changed. The janitor's simple act of speaking his decision to engage on his own terms, to assert his own intelligence and dignity in the face of a subtle challenge, was a moment of quiet rebellion. He had not needed to fight back with force, nor had he needed to shout or make a scene. His words, chosen with such care, pierced through the preconceived notions that had shaped the room. His mastery of Arabic wasn't the point. It was what that mastery represented: a breaking of the invisible boundaries that often separated people based on their social status, race, or perceived importance. He was a man of worth, not because of his job, but because of his mind, his dignity, his silence. Khalid, though outwardly composed, now understood that his assumptions had been shattered. The quiet, humble janitor had not only exposed his ignorance, but had also shown him and the entire room that real power does not lie in status or wealth. It lies in respect, in understanding, and in the ability to challenge the status quo with grace and intelligence. The janitor's linguistic skill became a symbol of silent revolution, an act of defiance against the ingrained biases that had long dictated the way power was viewed in the corporate world. The meeting continued, but the dynamics had shifted irrevocably.